and that we should not be intimidated by the state or other organizations saying that you shouldn't ever interview a terrorist, you shouldn't ever go and speak to. And a lot of the British press has had criticism recently for wanting to do things like speak to Salman Abedi's family. The state is sort of can't seem to make up its mind as to whether Salman Abedi is the person who was a suicide bomber at the concert in Manchester. And the state can't seem to work out whether in fact his brother is a terrorist. But the news organizations that have spoken to his brother have been heavily, heavily criticized by commentators and pundits for sort of glorifying terrorism, whereas this book is, and I believe right, to say it's part of the story. It's part of what is a more subtle and more nuanced story. And I think that's a really important point as well. About what, for me, books like this, I mean, this is really interesting to read, but I'm such a cynic, I'm sorry to say, because this is a kind of idealistic journalistic world. And it's very much a journalistic world in which the journalist can act, has full agency, and is not under market pressure, and is also not under state pressure, and not under the pressure of a society which is, and this is hinted at in the booklet, and again, UNESCO is obviously needing, this is intended as a neutral set of guidelines, and I commend it for that. If I were writing this in my own voice, and I'm sure that if the journalist and academic who wrote it had been writing in his own voice, he would have stated this more clearly, but the way in which the terrorist narrative can be co-opted by a state in its own interests. I live just outside of the most surveyed city in the world, and a large part of the encouragement of that, there's London, and a large part of the encouragement of that surveillance is around the narrative of terrorism. And so there is a really, really powerful social pressure on British journalists to not question the narrative of the state in the way it says that it is tackling terrorism. So despite the fact that this is a city that is the most surveilled city in the world, we have had 2 major or fairly substantial terrorist attacks in the last 4 months, 5 months now since the first attack in Westminster. So there is a discourse, there is a dissonance of discourse there, which I think journalists should challenge more. But I can appreciate that in the context of what this book is trying to do, that is not really something that's within that framework. But it is, I think, an extremely useful resource, and it does provide some, I hope, ammunition for journalists who are asking to be allowed to rely upon their own judgment and to use their own ethical guidance, because I think it does support that very much. And so it is very useful and a very important contributor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan, for your comments. And these are all such excellent comments. I wish we had had them before we started these publications. But of course, they inform our future thinking. Are there any comments from the floor, and you'd like to get more responses from our panelists? I think we have another mic up. Anybody got another mic here? Okay.
Is it me? Okay. That's why I have the microphone. Hi, my name's Julie Pizzetti. I'm from the University of Wollongong in Australia. I just wanted to make a comment. Sorry, I don't remember your name. You were talking about the issue with anonymity online. Yeah, sorry, I don't remember your name. Yes, you.
It's a Bearden.
Thank you. So I just think it's important to probably critique that point, that in the context of the issues that Megan was just highlighting, in the context of work that I've done for UNESCO on protecting journalism sources in the environment of surveillance, for example, I do think it's important for media scholars and particularly journalists and journalism academics to acknowledge the importance and value of anonymity, and that's connected to encryption and the arguments in favour of encryption as a defence against invasion of privacy. So I just wanted to make that point. I really loved this text that Megan was commenting on. I thought it was really thoughtful and good to have a framework. But I agree that coming as I do currently from a traditional media environment with a scholarly hat on, part of the time, the daily lived reality of journalists covering crises and disasters is difficult. So I'm wondering if perhaps there's a project there for like-minded collaborators to do things like create training notes or teaching notes or scenarios that might add value to books like that, so that you've got that practical possibility. Do you want me to hand this to someone else?
Thanks. My name is Jane Duncan from the University of Johannesburg, and congratulations on, I think, a very excellent and engaging panel. I've got a question about the social media and radicalization publication. The dominant and preferred model for protecting freedom of expression online when it comes to content has generally been a self-regulatory model. But the difficulty of that kind of model is that internet intermediaries can tend to be quite risk-averse and can pull stuff down at the slightest whiff of controversy. So I'm quite interested to see the recommendation that you've made about the need to evolve social media terms of service in a consultative manner. Can you maybe just unpack that a little bit more for us to help us to understand what the nature of that consultation should look like, so that internet intermediary terms of service aren't just simply being evolved by the companies themselves and all the attendant risks? And then I think just a general question in relation to all the three publications. Julie touched on the issue of encryption. Now, there's obviously been a major attack on encryption recently by various governments, and particularly in the wake of the Westminster attack, where WhatsApp's use of end-to-end encryption, I think, has been the subject of particular attack. Now, I know that when one looks at the evidence base, like the ACLU has done in the US when it comes to targeted lawful interception, encryption has actually played a very minimal role in frustrating the ability of law enforcement agents to actually get the information that they need through lawful interception. And I'm just wondering to what extent you've actually looked at the kind of the attack by states on encryption and the evidence base for the extent to which those attacks are actually warranted.
Thank you so much, Jane. I'll ask some people here to respond if they'd like, and also if they want to respond to Julie Possetti. I would just say there is actually another UNESCO publication called Human Rights and Encryption that came out last year. So have a look at that, because that, I think, is quite a good analysis of the impact of freedom of expression and impact of encryption debates on freedom of expression. So who wanted to respond to the point about what does it mean for the companies to be multi-stakeholder in the development of their policies?
Well, I agree with you. Part of the recommendation was that we were realizing that the companies were having their own response and no transparency about it, or very little transparency about it, and very much decisions made on a very personal basis by some of the social media owners themselves, Mark Zuckerberg, for instance. So the proposal is to have a much more multi-stakeholder approach, working with the social media, but also bringing to them the perspective of civil society and of journalists. So the example I have in mind is a French example, sorry for that, which is the Decodex, which is an initiative by Le Monde with Facebook. And they're trying to identify websites that are more or less legitimate, and they have a 5-range category system, and they are nourished by users. So you can download an app called Decodex on your computer, and whenever you are faced with a site, Twitter account, or whatever that is odd to you, you can report on it, and the journalist will analyze it and rate it. And they don't rate for specific article or content, which is part of a criticism, but also a response to not go towards censorship. They look at the general content of the whole entity that they look at. They're not going to pinpoint at one article per se. They're going to say this one is not neutral, this one has a terrorist leaning, etc., etc. And so it's becoming a database that is user-generated, but validated by journalists and supported by Facebook. If you see what I mean, the triangulation, which to me is a better system than just Facebook deciding, okay, we don't want pictures of nudes, so we remove them, full stop. I don't know if I answer your question, but it's an example of how this kind of situation could work, but probably you have better examples, right, from your research?
No, thank you. I think that, I mean, I agree with what you're saying, and I think it's a fundamental question. And I think what I would just emphasize is what we're finding with a lot of the self-regulatory mechanisms, it works great in practice, and there's lots of really important initiatives like the Global Network Initiative to set standards with civil society, academics, and companies, and there's a lot of internal processes that companies that sign up for the initiative follow, and those are great and important. But what we're seeing at the country level and with things like the European Commission's Code of Conduct on Hate Speech that was agreed to with Google, Facebook, Twitter, and Microsoft, and things like the German government right now considering hefty fines for companies for not taking down content within hate speech within 24 hours or illegal content. That on the surface, there's arguments you can make in favor of those things, and it's really tempting to want to stick it to the companies, right? And to like want to take down the arrogance of folks like Mark Zuckerberg one notch. But all of these measures, what they're doing is encouraging companies to take down content first and ask questions second. And that has really significant impacts for freedom of expression. So I think we have to be very careful of what the origins of a lot of these self-regulatory mechanisms are coming from, because they're still, I would emphasize, coming from state pressures, not only through bilateral conversations, but through very specific kind of legislative initiatives. And then lastly, I would just say, to your point, your question about law enforcement agencies and their kind of workings, another thing we have to be very concerned about is something like the Europol's Internet Referral Unit, which was built off of, or modeled off of the UK's similar thing. And basically, it's a unit that their job is to monitor the internet and refer things to companies to take down that content. And there's some question over whether it's contradictory to another EU security initiative called Check the Web, which is a database of a lot of kind of like terrorist-related content that's helping the security agencies in different countries kind of do their job of understanding what's out there. And so one arm's saying, you know, working with companies to take down stuff. The other is saying, hey, we need to better understand and monitor these groups, and we can do it by sharing information about what's online. So even within the law enforcement agency, there is that disconnect that I think you referenced in your question.
I wanted to echo what Davina said about multi-stakeholderism. It seems to me that in this area, any single-voiced response to the state of the digital environment today is going to be reflecting the interests of whichever actors are expressing that voice, whether that be the industry under self-regulation or even civil society, which is hardly unanimous in its view of these issues. So I think multi-stakeholder kinds of contexts in deliberating on these issues, especially about encryption, is essential in the way forward in the future. And I also wanted to just signal that the divisions of views at the EU level at the moment, at least as far as I understand it, they are against making encryption illegal. They want to protect anonymity, and yet the British government has quite a different view and will push that, and there is a coming conflict. But we are where we are, and I think it's really important to ask a question about how we go forward, because the digital environment does not stay the same over time. And the question is, how is it going to evolve, and which voices will be expressed in making choices about how it evolves. And I thought it was quite interesting to quote from my colleague Sonia Livingstone's report, which is on children's rights in digital media, which she did just recently. And the conclusion to that report is, it is possible and now urgent to encourage and enable states and other actors to recognize and identify key trends now, and to take the steps they can to marshal their resources to address early on the problems that can be foreseen. So the point being that although we don't have definitive evidence on issues as to what the future design and governance of the digital space will be, we cannot just sit and say we'll wait until we have sufficient evidence, because we will wait for a very, very long time. And in that context, one of the views that I have at least is that if we don't start tackling the resourcing, financial and otherwise, of the production of stuff, which is widely regarded by a multi-stakeholder environment as being either illegal or something which we would prefer did not happen, and I use we advisedly, then we will face these questions over and over, and we'll always be in a position of ex post responding to patching problems, to getting states to say we must understand more, and not being as proactive as maybe we should be in an environment where certain problems can be foreseen, even if we do not have the strongest and most definitive evidence base to support what those responses should be. Actors can come together and reach, if not consensus, certainly positions, temporary, to take action, to intervene, to make a difference. Thank you.
Okay, I think that was the perfect point to end on. I'm sorry, because I think that we are supposed to end at 12:30 and it's now 25 to. So I have two requests. One is I want to thank you, and I want you to thank the panel. Then I want the panel to look at me and I can take a photo of them. So thank you, everybody. Please give them a round of applause, and then I want to take the picture. There are a few copies of these